Good evening. Welcome. As I've said on each of the others of these occasions, if I said that properly, this is one of the great moments in the life of a college where we get to celebrate the remarkable accomplishments over a long arc of time of one of our colleagues. And tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the William Nelson Cromwell Professorship Inaugural Lecture. This professorship, as you may have read about, was created in 1949 by William Nelson Cromwell, a partner in the New York law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, probably some relationship there. Cromwell himself was not a Bowdoin grad, interestingly, and Al and I were just talking about whether there's a backstory we don't fully understand, but he was so deeply respected and so admired. Two of his partners, William Curtis, class of 1875, and Henry Pierce, class of 1896, that upon his death in his will, he provided for the establishment of this professorship at their alma mater. Quite remarkable. Our speaker, our honoree tonight, and the new holder of this chair is Professor Alan Springer. He is the third legendary Bowdoin professor to hold this title, after Athearn Daggett, who occupied the chair from 1951 to 1973, and the beloved Dick Morgan, who held the title from 1975 to 2014. And Gene is here with us tonight. We're thrilled you're here, Gene. Alan is, as you all know, an extraordinary teacher, a scholar, advisor, and remarkable mentor, and someone deeply worthy of the receipt of this honor. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce him tonight. Alan arrived at Bowdoin in 1976, having been at an undergraduate institution that we won't name, at Amherst, and quickly developed a reputation as a dynamic and committed teacher. For reasons that I'll have to explore, he decided to go to the dark side of administration, and while teaching, served as Dean of Students from 1980 to 1982, continuing to teach international law, environmental policy, humanitarian law, and U.S. foreign policy. He is well known for his warmth and humor, his intellectual rigor, his insight, and his practical advice. He was honored for his teaching and asked to deliver the Karofsky Encore Lecture in 2002. And in 2006, he was recognized by the Bowdoin Alumni Council with their award for faculty and staff. And in addition, he's received the Fletcher Family Award and a Faculty Research Award. Alan has written widely on the complications involved in multinational governance of the environment, many articles and 2 books out of that work, The International Law of Pollution, Protecting the Global Environment in the World of Sovereign States, and Cases of Conflict, Transboundary Disputes and the Development of International Environmental Law. There are generations of Bowdoin students who have relied on Alan for his thoughtful guidance about academic projects and future plans, including many discussions about whether they should, and I suspect should not, attend law school. Alan has been a mentor and role model for scores of Bowdoin students, and I have met many of them in my journeys around the country with our alumni. And they've gone on to careers as scholars and practitioners in public policy, environmental conservation, government, and law. So for all that Alan has done for our college, for scholarship, for our students, for the field of international law and government, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce him as our William Nelson Cromwell Professorship of Constitutional and International Law and Government. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating Alan.
Clayton, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here tonight. It really means a great deal to have all of you here. It is a genuine honor to receive the Cromwell Chair, in no small part because of the person who preceded me in it. Richard Morgan held the Cromwell Chair with such distinction for so many years. Dick was a good friend and a wonderful colleague, and we all miss him very much. I'd like to take the opportunity tonight to talk about a topic that I labeled simply institutional resilience. I have long been interested in the way institutions respond to changing international priorities, in my case focusing on issues of environmental protection. The question of how international institutions evolve, even survive in a changing world, seems particularly relevant today. I had actually hoped to avoid focusing on the Trump administration and thought it would be an interesting challenge to go through the entire evening without mentioning President Trump by name. However, as anyone who teaches contemporary politics knows, President Trump has become the elephant in the room in all matters of contemporary policy, and it is simply impossible to avoid the impact both he and his administration has had, both on perceptions of institutions and the views about the value of multilateral cooperation generally. The critical role the United States has played in building institutions that have shaped what is commonly called the liberal world order makes changing U.S. policies and attitudes a central concern, regardless of who is in power. But the challenges faced by international institutions are coming not just from Washington. Anyone who has watched the debate over breakfast, watched the debate over Brexit, or efforts by the European Union to craft a viable policy on immigration, or growing Russian assertiveness in Eastern Europe, is aware that broader global and regional pressures are at work. The term resilience is everywhere, used to describe everything, from the personality of Roger Stone to the qualities of flooring tiles. In the social sciences, interdisciplinary scholarship of people like Elinor Ostrom has employed concepts of resilience to help us understand better how institutions interact with pressures generated by the natural and political worlds in which they operate. A lively discussion has emerged about how to apply resilience to a broad range of institutional and social phenomena, particularly in response to the challenges posed by global climate change. To borrow a definition from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, resilience can be seen as the ability of institutions to absorb and recover from shocks while positively adapting and transforming in the face of long-term change and uncertainty. This definition recognizes that resilience represents not merely an institution's capacity to survive in the face of external pressures, but also its ability to change in ways that can enhance its effectiveness. Promoting institutional resilience suggests the need to strike a balance between continuing a commitment to existing practices and making adjustments that respond to new political and social forces, as well as changing perceptions of the problems that must be addressed. How that balance is struck will depend both on the specific institution and on the pressures that it faces. My goal tonight is to discuss briefly developments in three broad policy areas where existing institutions have been placed under stress: international security, humanitarian rights, and environmental protection, and to examine how issues of resilience can be used to help identify the challenges they face. One thing the emerging literature makes clear is that there is no simple formula for institutional resilience, that it is complex, multidimensional, and situational. But first, a quick autobiographical note to help explain my own evolving interest in institutions. I began graduate work at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University as United States involvement in the Vietnam War was coming to an end. This was also a tumultuous and turbulent time. Like many of that generation, I came to the study of international relations with the Vietnam conflict very much in mind. As perhaps can only happen at the Fletcher School, I found myself working simultaneously in the fields of security studies and international law, two very different subfields. While the realist theory of Hans Morgenthau could provide compelling explanations for the failure of United States policy in Vietnam, at Fletcher I was more drawn to the work of another Jewish scholar, Leo Gross, and his colleague Al Rubin. Like Morgenthau, Gross had studied in Europe with the noted legal scholar Hans Kelsen, and like Morgenthau, Gross had left Europe in a time of Nazi oppression. Morgenthau saw the failure to contain Hitler's rise as an indictment of the political naivete of the major powers and their over-reliance on organizations like the League of Nations to provide order. To understand the essence of international relations, one had to appreciate the nature of power and how it could be marshaled to protect the state's national interest. Gross, on the other hand, had worked at the League. He was a traditional international lawyer, a person committed to the idea that stronger international norms and better designed international institutions could be a positive force for peace. Studying both international law and security studies at Fletcher, I was in the unusual position of carrying to class two quite different study aids. The first was a little blue copy of the UN Charter. The second was a handheld bomb damage effects computer developed by the RAND Corporation. With this computer, actually a glorified slide rule, we could practice laying waste to the labs at MIT while trying to inflict only acceptable levels of damage on the Tufts campus. The fact that I still have the copy of the charter and not the RAND bomb damage effects computer suggests that I ultimately found the vision of Leo Gross and Al Rubin more compelling. While I was being introduced at Fletcher to the study of formal international law, scholars like Robert Cohane were applying the methodologies of social science to international institutions. Regime theory and later liberal institutionalism emerged, although their proponents worked in circles far removed from the world of international lawyers. These researchers tended to focus on the processes of state cooperation rather than on the formal rules so central to traditional legal research. In the early 1990s, the emergence of constructivist theories brought renewed interest in the power of norms and values to affect international behavior, as well as a more dynamic view of institutions, less as formal structures than as broad underlying social and political forces helping to shape state identities and behavior. More recently, historical institutionalists have joined the discussion, taking on directly the question of how institutions develop and change over time. The result is a rich body of collaborative research where the study of institutions and norms of all forms has come to occupy a central place. These norms include the more formal rules of international law on which I was so focused early in my career. I continue to believe that the law matters and deserves our attention as we assess the resilience of institutions in the face of contemporary pressures. Core institutional rules that are ambiguous, weak, or simply inconsistent with the political environment in which an institution is situated can undermine its resilience. However, changing core rules is not easy, requiring not only a recognition of the need for change, but also the political commitment to do so. Institutional resilience may sometimes require creative adaptation, working around rather than trying to amend norms so fundamental to the institution that even initiating a process of reform could challenge the institution's survival. International institutions must adapt to political and social realities they have only a limited ability to shape. In the early days of the United Nations, the protection the veto afforded the permanent members of the Security Council led to an institutional paralysis in the polarized context of the Cold War. The major powers that had once been viewed as the best hope to prevent armed conflict had become its most dangerous source. A system of collective security based on great power cooperation was replaced by peacekeeping and preventive diplomacy, in which the General Assembly would play a more central role. The changes were controversial, as both governments and international lawyers suggested that the Charter was being amended illegally. Yet this shift in institutional approach was likely necessary if the UN was to remain relevant in matters of peace and security. In the environmental arena, important policy initiatives have emerged from the organizations originally designed to promote economic growth. The United Nations Economic for Europe helped develop a convention to protect the stratospheric ozone layer that is widely considered among the world's most effective environmental regimes. Institutions with a more clearly environmental mandate have also seen remarkable changes in their priorities and policies. The International Whaling Commission, originally established to promote the interests of the whaling industry, moved to embrace a ban on commercial whaling that is held since the early 1980s. Japan's recent decision to quit the commission and return to commercial whaling suggests the danger that such major institutional transformations can present, but few would argue that the Commission should have remained committed solely to the original purposes of the 1946 Convention. Institutional change is thus both necessary and beneficial, and more than a few international institutions have been criticized for being too slow to embrace it. Yet what has been termed institutional stickiness can also provide essential stability in the face of political challenges that attack not simply unwanted organizational policies, but more fundamentally the legitimacy of the institutions themselves and the underlying processes of cooperation on which they depend. The Trump administration has been at the forefront of such an assault, campaigning and later taking action against trade agreements like NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Iran nuclear deal. The attack on the International Criminal Court led by John Bolton is among the latest steps designed to distance the United States even further from the ICC. And the United States recently announced plans to suspend the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with no clear plan to replace it. Few international institutions have been spared. In the security arena, NATO has been a particular target of President Trump, who has openly questioned its continued relevance. The alliance has faced challenges to its institutional future before. Perhaps the most serious test came in the early 1990s, as NATO was forced to redefine its role in a world in which the Russian threat it was created to counter had seemingly evaporated. With the decision to expand NATO to incorporate former Warsaw Pact enemies came the opportunity to develop NATO as a collective security organization attempting to resolve intra-regional disputes. Expansion also enhanced NATO's capacity to address threats posed by what had previously been considered out-of-area issues in places like Afghanistan. These represented important, if controversial, new directions for the alliance, but steps that helped cement its continued relevance. In the face of President Trump's rhetorical broadsides, some observers have taken comfort in the apparent gap between the president's words and American actions on the ground. The United States continues to play an active role in NATO exercises close to Russian borders and has supported the decision to admit Macedonia to the alliance. In response to Russian pressures on Ukraine, not even an alliance member, the Trump administration has gone farther than the Obama administration by providing the Ukrainian government with Javelin anti-tank weapons. Even President Trump's shift from general anti-NATO commentary to a demand for increased European defense expenditures was seen by some as reassuring, as it helped shift the transatlantic debate onto more familiar terrain. Those confident in NATO's continued vitality can point to close working relationships between high-ranking members of the NATO military as helping to provide ties that even the harshest rhetoric would seem unlikely to unravel. Another factor that makes talk of NATO irrelevance seem misplaced is new Russian assertiveness along NATO's borders. Few suggest that Russia is contemplating direct military action against any alliance member. However, awareness of the danger posed by Russian cyber warfare capabilities and Russia's willingness to use them to disrupt Western elections present a clear threat to the common interests of NATO members that should promote continued cooperation. Moreover, despite talk of the possibility of France and Germany developing a European army to take on the role traditionally played by the United States, the economic and political costs of moving in this direction, as well as the danger of precipitating further American disengagement, work against such an option. From the U.S. perspective, it is difficult to envision any alternative system of multilateral defense cooperation that would more clearly serve United States interests and also give the United States such a decisive voice in its policies. All of this helps explain the confidence many people have in NATO's resilience. Yet NATO's expansion came with political and economic costs beyond negative reaction from Russia. Expansion extended the alliance's area of protection to states of Eastern Europe, whose security might seem to some in the United States less central to American interests than that of our traditional Western European allies. The rise of illiberal regimes in NATO countries like Hungary also raises serious questions about whether the assumption of shared values on which the alliance was founded can be sustained indefinitely. NATO was built on the fundamental promise of mutual assistance in the case of an armed attack directed at any alliance member in Europe or North America. Article 5 of the 1949 NATO agreement calls for each member to treat such an attack as an attack on all and take such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Much was made of President Trump's initial reluctance to take the Article 5 pledge during a 2017 NATO summit. Relief was expressed when he finally did, albeit later in comments at the White House and not among NATO leaders. Yet Trump's comments a year later suggesting that defending any tiny alliance member Montenegro could trigger war with Russia only rekindled concern about the extent of the United States commitment. Words do matter, but simply asserting a belief in Article 5 does not resolve the issue. Article 5 requires members only to take the action they individually deem necessary. NATO's history reflects the continuing challenge the American government has faced in convincing both allies and Russia that the United States would take active measures to defend Europe if U.S. territory had not been directly attacked. Moreover, the threats currently posed to NATO likely fall short of the armed attack envisioned in Article 5, even if they could have equally devastating consequences, thus making even more ambiguous the nature of the U.S. treaty commitment. This is not to suggest that this would be a good time to renegotiate the NATO agreement. Far from it. The clarity of commitment that was not possible in 1949 is certainly not possible today. The threats we currently face would be difficult to define. In any case, treaty language alone could never force a reluctant ally to act. What the current situation does suggest is for leaders across the North Atlantic region to reaffirm their commitment to collective action to protect what the NATO preamble calls the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. The recent House vote in the NATO Support Act, which would prevent federal funds from being used to pull the United States out of NATO, was more than symbolic. The measure passed with broad bipartisan support and provided an opportunity for both Republicans and Democrats to speak out in explicit terms about the significance of NATO to U.S. security interest. It is important to keep in mind that few people alive today remember the world in which the original NATO agreement was signed. There is little doubt that President Trump's attacks on the alliance, well publicized during the 2016 campaign, have resonated among at least some within American society who question the value of maintaining extensive overseas commitments. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's recent reluctance to assert U.S. willingness to defend Montenegro only underscores the fact that maintaining domestic support for NATO remains an ongoing challenge. The protection of people seeking asylum is a second area where international institutions have been placed under unusual stress. The problem is not unprecedented. As the 1970s and 80s witnessed large numbers of Vietnamese and later Cubans and Haitians leaving home in search of political refuge. Violent conflict from the Middle East to Central Africa to the former Yugoslavia drove millions across international borders in the 1990s. What is different today is the scale of the problem and the extent to which issues of political asylum and refugee protection have become enmeshed in the larger debate over international migration. The number of those displaced by war, crime, and harsh economic conditions has increased dramatically in recent years. Statistics from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimate that in 2017 globally, there were over 3 million asylum seekers, nearly 20 million people granted temporary protection as refugees, and over 39 million people considered internally displaced. Of particular concern is the high concentration of people in a relatively small number of countries, many of which are seriously limited in their ability to provide even basic humanitarian protection. Modern efforts to protect civilians displaced by armed conflict date back to the end of World War II. The focus then was on Europe, where more than 11 million people were uprooted either by fighting or by deliberate government policies of ethnic cleansing during the war and forced repatriation afterwards. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, founded in 1950, became the primary United Nations body responsible for issues of refugee protection. As the challenges posed by forced migration have grown, so has the UNHCR's mandate and the scale of its operations. Although originally intended to exist for only 3 years, the UNHCR now operates in 128 countries with a budget of over $6 billion. The 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees provides the legal foundation for international refugee protection. Like the UNHCR, the Convention is a product of the period in which it was created. Developed in the aftermath of the horrors of World War II and in the spirit of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention focuses on the rights of individuals. Article 1 of the Convention defines a person deserving refugee status as someone with a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and someone who is either unable or unwilling because of that fear to return to or be protected by his country of nationality. Like many international institutions, the system surrounding the rules of asylum and refugee protection is a hybrid one. For states that are signatories, and a number of important states are not, the Refugee Convention establishes the basic rights individuals should enjoy in the countries they enter. The most important, a right so fundamental that the Convention permits no reservations, is the right of non-refoulement, the right to not be forcibly returned to the country a refugee has fled. The Convention also outlines responsibilities states accept in ratifying the agreement. However, with no formal system of enforcement, the action required to give practical effect to the rights refugees enjoy depends entirely on national administrative agencies and judicial bodies. Since few states have been prepared to apply the language of the Convention directly, how they integrate the rules of the Convention into domestic law and then interpret them in practice is critical. Many important Convention standards are subject to multiple interpretations. This includes the key question of how to determine whether an asylum seeker has a fear of persecution that is actually well-founded and linked to grounds for which protection should be given under the Convention. Other issues, such as the rights of individuals found on the high seas to claim political asylum, are simply not addressed in the Convention. The resilience of asylum as an institutional process depends on the ability of national authorities to maintain practices that are consistent with the original intent of the Refugee Convention. National courts can play an important role in pushing back against executive actions that seem inconsistent with the rules of refugee protection. In the United States, federal courts have placed at least temporary roadblocks against efforts by the Trump administration to put limits on the ability of individuals, including children, to make asylum claims. Institutional resilience can also be promoted by encouraging greater consistency within and across national jurisdictions. The UNHCR has developed a handbook providing guidance to encourage national authorities to adopt a common approach to some of the many difficult questions they face in refugee admission decisions. The UNHCR has also attempted to intervene in a number of individual cases by submitting amicus briefs. Greater consistency in the way asylum claims are treated could also be promoted by encouraging national immigration judges to look for guidance from the decisions of their colleagues in other countries. This could broaden what Anne-Marie Slaughter has termed a transnational judicial dialogue to help insulate court decisions from too narrow a political perspective. However, there is just so much that even well-intentioned administrators and judges can do to protect the international asylum regime. The political pressures to restrict all forms of integration are both genuine and widespread. Given the number and uneven distribution of people seeking asylum, collective burden sharing has become a challenge that can no longer be ignored. This is an issue that the Refugee Convention, with its focus on the rights of individuals, simply did not address. Burden sharing has become a central concern of the European Union and other regional organizations, but it is also being acknowledged globally. Last December, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Global Compact on Refugees, a companion to the Global Compact on Migration passed the week before. Among its priorities is to encourage the voluntary return of people to their home countries once the conditions that drove them to leave have been addressed. Improved efforts at third country resettlement and assistance in promoting the local integration of those populations who remain within their host countries are also on the agenda of a global refugee forum that will begin meeting on a regular basis later this year. The Compact represents an important step politically. It recognizes the complexity of the refugee problem, while at the same time at least attempting to separate issues of refugee protection from the broader concerns posed by international migration. This is not easy given the interconnected forces that cause people to cross international boundaries, a reality reflected in the expanded work of the UNHCR with all forms of migrants and internally displaced persons. But the Compact is only a very limited step. Non-binding and relying on voluntary funding, it also presents challenges of institutional coordination. A recent study identified 27 different United Nations-related agencies working on various dimensions of the migration problem. The Compact recognizes the need to deal with the root causes of the refugee issue. Yet this requires a willingness to tackle challenges ranging from gang violence in Central America to civil conflict in the Middle East. These are very tough issues to address, especially in a political environment dominated by voices calling for retrenchment and a focus on more narrowly defined national interests. Nowhere has the development of institutions been as dramatic as in response to threats to the environment. Since the early 1970s, thousands of international agreements have been signed, creating a complex web of organizations only loosely coordinated by the United Nations Environment Program. UNEP was hampered from its origins at the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment by serious disagreement between developed and developing nations over the priority that should be given to environmental issues. Yet even with the growing recognition of the need for collective action, repeated efforts to develop a more efficient and centralized organizational structure have been largely ineffective. Climate change has been recognized as the most important environmental threat facing the planet. However, when heads of state gathered in Rio in 1992 to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference, governments were only beginning to appreciate the depth and complexity of the problem. There was no consensus on how to apportion the cost of mitigation efforts. What they did have was the institutional model of a framework convention, which had been used successfully in the 1980s to respond to stratospheric ozone depletion. A framework convention could provide a general definition of the problem and the goals states hope to achieve, but initially commit the parties to do little more than cooperate to address it. More precise obligations could be added later in the form of optional protocols. When it came into force in 1994, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change became the institutional home of efforts to tackle the problem. The convention represented a limited, if political necessary, compromise given the dominant political forces in 1992. It established as a core institutional objective the stabilization of greenhouse gases and created a conference of the parties to provide a forum for ongoing discussions about climate change. This kept the issue on crowded international agendas and developed bureaucratic support both within the United Nations and beyond for programs designed to respond. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has provided important periodic assessments on the scientific evidence of both the reality of climate change and the seriousness of the threats it presents. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was added, providing legally binding targets and timetables to limit greenhouse gas emissions, although the failure of the United States to ratify the protocol and uneven implementation of the agreement by those who did limited its effectiveness. However, the Framework Convention itself has limitation, in part because of key assumptions embedded in the agreement. The Convention embraces language familiar to many environmental agreements, recognizing that states have common but differentiated responsibilities in responding to climate change. It provides a long list of criteria to differentiate those responsibilities, offering states multiple bases on which to argue that their special circumstances limit what should be expected of them. The Convention also divides states into two main groups, with only developed states accepting a legal obligation to control greenhouse gas emissions. In 1992, this differentiation was certainly defensible, both morally and politically. Developed and developing states had contributed very differently to the greenhouse gas problem and were very differently placed to respond. However, this division of states was ultimately unsustainable, particularly as major developing countries like China and India emerged as major sources of greenhouse gases. The need to re-examine key regime assumptions became evident when the parties met in Copenhagen in 2009 to discuss extending the Kyoto Protocol. Lacking support for strong domestic legislation in the United States, the Obama administration helped forge the Copenhagen Accord, which shifted climate mitigation efforts from binding targets and timetables to a system of voluntary emissions reductions. While this approach could now be accepted by key developing countries, for those still committed to the Kyoto approach, it seemed a regressive step. However, it provided a foundation for the 2015 Paris Agreement, under which the parties agreed to take nationally determined measures to meet the collective goal, now more precisely defined, of holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreement represents an institutional adaptation that may well enhance the resilience of global climate policy. Earlier executive actions by the Obama administration to reduce U.S. emissions were reinforced both by the agreement and the Framework Convention to which it was linked. While the Trump administration has taken steps to undo some of these policies, many will take time to implement. President Trump has also declared his intention to renounce the Paris Agreement itself once that becomes possible later this year. However, the stickiness of the Paris regime is reflected in the fact that the United States cannot formally withdraw until 2022, just after the presidential election. The Trump administration appears willing, at least for now, to continue participating in meetings of the parties to the Framework Convention. This may be a mixed blessing for environmentalists. At recent meetings in Poland, the United States was roundly criticized for its public support for enhanced coal production. The United States also worked with Russia and Kuwait to soften the conference's references to a special IPCC report on the severity of global warming. However, U.S. negotiators were actively involved in developing transparency standards for reporting national greenhouse gas emissions, a key step in making the Paris approach effective. With the shift in U.S. climate policy, other states, including China and France and the European Union, have indicated a willingness to take on a greater leadership role. What this means in practice is unclear. Strong leadership will be needed to develop the rules required to implement the existing agreement, and more important, to build support for the even more ambitious steps required in the future to meet the agreement's objectives. The Paris Agreement, with its emphasis on voluntary action, helped open up the negotiating process, bringing into discussion representatives of private companies, non-governmental organizations, and governmental actors at the regional, state, and local levels. In the United States, organizations like the We Are Still In Coalition and America's Pledge are working to help implement the Paris Agreement, even if the United States does withdraw. Local initiatives will be all the more critical if national level policies like the imposition of carbon taxes encounter the kind of fierce political opposition faced recently by the French government. Beyond the Paris framework, other international environmental organizations and groups like the G20 will continue to address aspects of the climate problem. This should reinforce what seems likely to evolve into a decentralized and somewhat chaotic, but hopefully more resilient pattern of institutional response. Unfortunately, institutional resilience does not guarantee institutional effectiveness. New scientific reports released almost monthly indicate that the pace of global warming is accelerating. A system of what still remain limited, voluntary national measures to reduce greenhouse gases may simply not be enough. The resources made available through the Paris process to address the effects of climate change may also be too limited. Just as NATO security requires more than verbal acceptance of Article 5, and asylum protections will not be sustained by a voluntary compact alone, the climate regime may ultimately require stronger normative commitments and tougher institutional structures to address the serious challenges we face. These commitments, though inevitably moored in politics, should also be anchored in law. Thank you. And now, since I'm standing here, I think I'm supposed to ask people if they would like to make any comments or ask any questions. Please come on down, absolutely. Yeah, the stairs are tricky.
My name is Paul Diamond. Having worked in the UN Secretariat for 30 years, I was hanging on every word. I've been gone for 25 years, but all the trends we could see in the 90s are really being out there, just waiting for someone to pick them up. So much of the response to major tragedies and challenges has been done on a muddling through basis. What concerns me is that as the crisis gets stronger and water levels rise and so on, is the fear that the developed countries will focus their entire response within their national challenges. So may I ask how the international organizations can respond if that happens?
I think you've put your finger on what is obviously one of the key problems with the Paris Accord, because by building on voluntary national action, it's only natural that governments will respond to those domestic constituencies who are most concerned about protecting seawalls and doing other things domestically. I think that is one of the reasons why people are still hoping to keep alive some of the spirit of the Kyoto Protocol, even as you begin to build, hopefully, a broader sort of geographic base in countries like India and China for taking national measures there. I do think that people in the developed world are going to see limits to what they're going to be able to achieve through national policies, particularly as we see the spread of greenhouse gas emissions to other countries. Right now, I do worry that what we have in terms of an institutional framework is so much geared to voluntary action and so much designed to bring everyone to the table with a limited amount, a very limited amount of what we might call sort of top-down organization that in many ways has been discredited by the failure of the Kyoto Protocol to do more, that this is going to be an ongoing issue. But it's also why I do believe, and again, I'm not suggesting that one is going to be able to dictate by convention that nations behave differently, but I think as we begin to see the limits of how far Paris can go, we may begin to see more pressures to think in more creative ways institutionally. We may also see other organizational structures begin to take on greater roles in their specific areas of responsibility, as through, for instance, the Montreal Protocol, where there has been at least work on some very important related issues. But I totally agree that this is my concern. It is the concern I have that in an effort to maintain momentum, to encourage quote-unquote resilience, we may have lost some of the degree of what may be required in terms of governmental control to take more effective actions, and I agree.
Thank you for that talk, Professor Springer. Okay, well, just to anticipate what Professor Yarbrough is going to say in response to my question, she would say, "Oh, Jeff, you're such a Madisonian."
You're welcome to go down there, Gene, and start the dialogue.
I take as a compliment.
Oh,
oh. All right,
you may not get a chance to
I'll ask my Madisonian question. Professor Yarbrough will ask her Hamiltonian question,
okay.
And we'll call it a night. Institutional resilience. Is there resilience to be found in patterns of political organization? Because what I was hearing, what a cynical or to play devil's advocate, there's a lot of talk about especially legal institutions, and they sound like a little bit like policy commitments, or but not really necessarily attachments, that they're not clearly connected to the ground level of politics and interests and of feelings and passions. So is there something to be found in patterns of political organization that might bear resilient fruit?
Well, I mean, and you're absolutely right. There's quite a gap between normally what happens in New York or happens in Geneva and what is happening on the ground, and that is a very important gap to try to close. I do think there are models, and God help me if we keep beating on the Montreal Protocol as an example of something that might work. I think there you have a case where a framework convention sort of identified a problem and got people moving on the issue, and then science was very quickly brought in, and I think in some ways that were pretty creative, and private industry and NGOs were brought together, again, in some fairly interesting ways in a fairly short period of time to identify alternative strategies that people hadn't thought about even 2 years earlier when they negotiated the agreement. That is, at least in theory, the virtue of a framework convention, that it opens up the process, brings more people to the table, is more dynamic, more responsive, and therefore can be resilient in the sense that it can be sustained over time as more people come to the table and more evidence is there. Now, one of the challenges in using that as a model is that that particular problem was one in which a relatively few countries were pretty dominant. It was also a problem in which the ways of regulating it and, in fact, the tools that were available to policymakers were relatively easy to use. And in fact, I would argue that one of the problems we faced in climate change is that we too easily tried to take that model of what looked like a new dynamic institution and tried to simply apply it wholesale to a climate change problem that was really very different. So I do think it's possible to envision patterns of institutional development that can be more dynamic than the traditional models we have. We don't have to have a UN charter that gives effectively the 5 permanent members of the Security Council veto power indefinitely. And I think people are searching for those. And I think a lot of it is going to be finding fusions between governmental power, which I think still is going to be important to do some of the things that we're going to need to do, but also opening up the discussion to bring people there into the room who can help push the nature of that regulation forward, particularly on a national level where a lot of this stuff is going to have to happen, as it always has within international institutions. International institutions don't often act in a very direct way. They're almost always acting through other agents and agencies, and I think that finding ways to bring those who would be most effective in dealing with problems like climate change into the room, giving them voice and allowing their changing perceptions of what's going on to be recognized and responded to by institutions is going to be crucial. Now, obviously, one of the challenges is doing that on a global level, and one of the reasons it's been so difficult to deal with climate change through 190 plus countries operating in places like Copenhagen is the sheer number of interests involved. And I think there are going to be, I specifically focus on regional organizations, but there are definitely going to be opportunities for organizations operating at lower levels to take on key elements of this and hopefully remove some of that gap. Yes, I sense Jean is coming. Invited as she was by Jeff.
I want to thank you for a talk that was so inclusive of so many different problems. And the one that I was most taken with was the first one of national security. And I honestly want to ask you a question about Europe, because from what little I've read, the European nations have no capacity, no military capacity to defend themselves. I remember a hilarious article in the Wall Street Journal that the Belgians have more members in the marching band, and they have 1 helicopter for their entire country. And if you just think about the capacity of the Europeans to defend themselves without us, it does appear as if it's really quite one-sided. And I just wonder, you did talk about how much they contribute and what difficult problems there are, but a related problem is just whether they're prepared to increase their own military arsenals.
Well, fortunately, Laura's here, and we can make her come down, and we can just keep this government department dialogue going because she knows much more about this than I do. My first reaction is, again, it depends on military capacity to do what. And I think one of the concerns people have assumed to be an issue is that the United States would simply be replaced entirely by a quote-unquote European army. And one of the issues that certainly would come up in that context is the question of nuclear deterrence and whether some combination of France and that has been discussed, a nuclearized Germany could provide a minimal deterrent that would effectively replace what the United States has in theory attempted to provide over these years. Again, I think there have been, and again, if we're talking about Belgium alone, I think we would be talking about a rather limited military capability. But the French, and again, depending on what role the British play in a larger European context, and the Germans have rather substantial military capacities to deal with certain kinds of problems. Now, if we're re-envisioning the creation of the Soviet Red Army and what we saw in the 1970s and 80s, I agree, and I think if the Europeans saw that on the horizon, it would be all the more reason why the United States would be people would be very reluctant to have the U.S. leave. And frankly, I do think that there are many in Europe, many in public in Europe, who simply don't want to spend the money on that kind of a military capability that they don't think is going to be necessary, that there are other ways to address what they see as legitimate security threats that won't require the equivalent of the United States Army. And of course, keep in mind that the Obama administration was also looking very seriously at reductions in Europe, even at a time when there was awareness of some of the threats posed by Russia. And again, a little bit depends on what kinds of concerns you have. And again, my sense is that what NATO will be responding to, at least in the short to medium term, is going to be more asymmetric kinds of threats from things like cyber security, cyber warfare, than any kind of direct military attack against an alliance member. I do think forces are important to create confidence, particularly among new members of the alliance, that their interests will be protected. And we've seen this in some of the states most directly connected with the Russians. But again, I don't think one necessarily has to have a huge military commitment in order to address those concerns, at least now. But as we know, things do change. And there's a dynamic in Europe that wasn't there 10 years ago. So that's not a good answer, but it's a partial one. I'm happy to take any other questions. If not, I thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful evening.